Nobody announces they're about to disrespect your boundaries. They test first. Small, quiet, almost forgettable if you're not paying attention. And by the time it's obvious, it's usually already happened 4 or 5 times before. Today, 6 of those quiet signs, the ones almost everyone misses, and exactly what the Stoics would tell you to do the moment you spot the first one. Epictetus taught something most people misread as coldness. He said we shouldn't be surprised when people act according to their nature, that expecting otherwise is what causes most of our suffering. But there's a second half to that teaching people skip. Recognizing someone's nature early isn't cynicism, it's information. And most of us are trained, almost against our will, to explain away the early information instead of using it. We tell ourselves it was a bad day, a misunderstanding, not their real intention. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's the first data point in a pattern we're choosing not to see yet, because seeing it would mean having to do something about it. Sign 1. They apologize and then do the exact same thing again within days, sometimes hours. Not a different version of it, the same thing. Picture this. Someone borrows money and says they'll pay it back Friday. Friday comes and goes, no message. You bring it up, they apologize, seem genuinely embarrassed, promise it's handled by next week. Next week arrives, same silence. A real apology changes behavior, even slightly, even imperfectly. A test apology just resets the clock, buying them another attempt without actually costing them anything real. If you find yourself accepting the same apology for the same thing more than twice, that's not you being patient. That's the test working exactly as intended. Sign 2. In this one's sneakier because it never feels big enough to mention out loud. They start with something genuinely small, borrowing something without asking first, showing up 15 minutes late without a word of explanation, making a comment they know lands wrong, then immediately calling it a joke. If you don't respond, even mildly, even just a raised eyebrow, the next test gets slightly bigger. 15 minutes late becomes 30. One small comment becomes a pattern of them. This is not random escalation. Psychologists call this foot-in-the-door behavior, and manipulative or boundary testing people use it constantly, often without even consciously planning it, simply because it works, and it's worked on them before with other people. Marcus Aurelius wrote about staying alert to the difference between what's actually happening and the story you're telling yourself about why it's fine. That gap right there between the small thing and your explanation for it is exactly where boundary testing hides, and it hides well because your own kindness is doing the concealing for them. Think about how often this actually plays out in ordinary life. A coworker takes credit for a small idea in a meeting, just once, just a passing comment, nothing dramatic enough to raise with HR. You let it go because raising it feels disproportionate to what happened. A friend cancels plans last minute for the 3rd time, always with a reasonable sounding excuse, always apologetic in the moment. You don't say anything because each individual cancellation, taken alone, seems too small to mention. That's exactly the design. Nothing on its own is ever quite enough to justify a conversation. It's only the pattern, stacked over weeks or months, that becomes unmistakable. And by then, most people have convinced themselves they're overreacting simply because so much time has already passed. Here's the part that reframes everything else in this video. These 6 signs aren't 6 separate personality flaws, scattered and unrelated. They're one single pattern, repeating in different disguises, depending on the situation and the person. The person isn't randomly rude one day, and randomly late the next, and randomly dismissive the week after. They're running a low-cost experiment on you, over and over, in different forms, to find out exactly where your actual limit is, because most people never say it out loud in the first place, and silence is the easiest signal in the world to misread as permission. And once you see that, once you see it as one experiment instead of 6 coincidences, Sign 3 lands completely differently. Sign 3, the silent treatment, specifically after you say no. Not after a real conflict, not after a fight with clear stakes on both sides, after a boundary. A simple, reasonable no, and suddenly the warmth disappears for a day, 2 days, sometimes longer, with no explanation offered. This is one of the clearest tells there is because it reveals the no was never actually about the specific request in the first place. It was about whether you're allowed to have limits at all, and the silence is the punishment for having tried. Sign 4. They turn the thing you asked them to stop into a joke, specifically in front of other people. Privately, one-on-one, they might even seem to respect it completely. Publicly, in a group, it becomes material, something to reference for a laugh, sometimes aimed directly at you, sometimes framed as being about you without using your name. Imagine you've asked a family member not to comment on your weight anymore. Alone with you, they don't. At a holiday dinner, in front of everyone, it becomes a light-hearted joke, delivered with a smile, immediately followed by, "I'm just kidding, don't be so sensitive," if you react at all. That single sentence does two things at once. It violates the boundary, and it preemptively blames you for noticing. Seneca warned about people who perform virtue for an audience, while abandoning it completely the moment no one's watching. This is the same exact dynamic, just aimed at your boundary instead of their own stated values. The version of them you get in private and the version you get in public are not the same person, and that gap tells you which one is real. It's almost always the public version, the one performed for an audience, because that's the version they've decided has less consequence attached to it. Sign 5, and this is the one people confuse with real change more than any other. Remorse only shows up when they get caught, not when they realize the actual impact of what they did. Watch closely here. Real regret responds to harm, to the fact that something was hurt or broken. Test regret responds to consequences, to the fact that they got caught or called out. From a distance, in the moment, these two things can look almost identical. Both involve an apology, both can involve tears, both can sound sincere. Up close, over time, they behave completely differently because one changes future behavior and the other only changes behavior when someone's watching. Here's a simple way to tell them apart, one that works more reliably than almost anything else. Ask yourself whether you brought it up or whether they did. If they came to you unprompted, before you'd said a word, that's usually real. If the remorse only arrived after you found out, after you asked a pointed question, after evidence made denial impossible, that's usually strategic, whether or not they'd ever consciously frame it that way to themselves. Most people aren't lying when they apologize in that second scenario. They genuinely feel bad. But feeling bad about being caught and feeling bad about the harm caused are two very different internal experiences, and only one of them reliably predicts what happens the next time no one's watching. Let's pause here for a second, because sign 6 is the one most people label completely wrong. And once you hear it described properly, you won't stop recognizing it. If none of these 5 get named out loud, here's what actually happens next. Slowly, almost without you noticing it happening in real time. You don't just lose ground with that one specific person in that one specific relationship. You start preemptively shrinking around everyone, in relationships that have nothing to do with the original person, because your nervous system generalizes the lesson underneath all of this. Boundaries don't hold, so why bother stating them clearly at all? This is exhausting in a way that's genuinely hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived through it themselves. You're not just tolerating one difficult relationship anymore. You're quietly rewriting how much space you believe you're allowed to take up in every single relationship you have, including the ones that were never the problem in the first place. There's a second cost too, one that's easy to miss because it doesn't feel like loss in the moment. It feels like being easygoing, like being the low-maintenance one. But being chronically easy to test isn't actually a personality trait you were born with. It's a skill you were taught, usually early, usually by people who benefited from you never quite learning the alternative. Every unaddressed sign doesn't just cost you that one interaction. It reinforces, a little more each time, the belief that your comfort is the most negotiable thing in the room. And that belief doesn't stay contained to one relationship. It follows you into new ones, into workplaces, into friendships that haven't even started yet, quietly setting the terms before a single word has been exchanged. And that brings us to the sixth sign, the one that lives inside you, not inside them. Sign 6. You start rehearsing your own boundaries in your head like an apology before you've even said anything out loud to anyone. You draft the message 5 times. You soften it until it barely resembles a boundary at all. You add, "if that's okay," and "no worries either way," to something that was never actually optional for your own well-being. If you're pre-justifying a limit before you've even stated it, some part of you has already absorbed the idea that having one is unreasonable to begin with. That's not weakness, and it was never a character flaw. That's the accumulated residue of every unaddressed test that came before this one, quietly teaching you to ask permission for things that never required it. So what do the Stoics actually say to do with all of this? Not revenge, not a dramatic confrontation staged for effect. Epictetus was specific, almost clinically so. Name what's within your control and act only there. You can't control whether someone tests a limit that was never yours to control in the first place. You can control whether you name it, calmly, clearly, the first time it happens, not the 5th time after resentment has already built a home inside you. A flat, unemotional, "that doesn't work for me," said early, costs you almost nothing in the moment. And it ends most of these patterns before they ever get the chance to become patterns at all. Because most testing behavior relies entirely on the assumption that you won't say anything. There's a second layer to this that's worth sitting with. Naming a boundary the first time doesn't just stop that specific behavior. It changes what the other person now knows about you, permanently, in a way that carries into every future interaction. People adjust their behavior based on the data they've collected about what you'll tolerate. Every time you let something slide silently, you're adding a data point that says more is available. Every time you name it early, calmly, without drama, you're adding a data point that says, this is where it ends. Over time, people stop testing the areas where the data is already clear and start respecting them without you having to say anything at all, because the pattern has already been established. This doesn't mean every relationship where testing occurs will survive the boundary being named. Some won't, and that's information too, not a failure on your part. Someone who disappears the moment a limit gets stated was never actually respecting you before that moment either. They were respecting your silence. The goal here was never to become suspicious of everyone around you, scanning every interaction for hidden motives. It was to stop mistaking your own silence for peace, when really, it was just the absence of a conversation you were too afraid to start. None of this requires becoming harder, colder, or less generous than you already are. If anything, it protects the exact qualities that made you worth testing in the first place. The patience, the willingness to give people the benefit of the doubt, the instinct to assume good faith before bad. Those traits aren't the problem, and they were never something to apologize for. The only thing that needed to change was the gap between noticing and naming, the space where 6 quiet signs used to slip through unaddressed, one small test at a time, until they added up to something much larger than any single moment ever suggested they would. If you recognized even one of these 6 in your own life tonight, that's not a failure on your part, and it never was. That's the first correctly identified signal in a pattern most people never name at all, not once, in their entire lives. Tell me in the comments which one you spotted first. That's usually the one worth actually addressing this week, not the other 5.